Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, the whatever one today. There's been so much going on, breaking news and whatever. This is one of my regular ones about military aid, but actually it's going to take into account the breaking news that we've heard in terms of the EU provisions that are being put in place or sketched out. I don't know how, I don't know when we're going to see this, and whether there are hurdles towards getting this done in terms of unanimity across Europe. But anyway, we're going to talk about the European plans, and we're obviously going to talk about the American halting of aid and the ramifications of that decision. Right, we'll start with Ursula von der Leyen's decision or announcement today, and actually going to read through this in Politico to give us a sense of exactly what's going on. So the EU pushes emergency plan to send 150 billion euros in defence loans to governments. Hours after Trump suspends aid to Ukraine, von der Leyen unveils a blueprint to help countries rearm and send weapons to Kyiv. So this is both about making Europe stronger and Ukraine stronger, or the EU stronger and Ukraine. The EU's latest response to Trump's decision to walk away from America's long-standing protection of Europe is to announce a plan to send loans of up to 150 billion euros to governments to help them boost military spending, facing the most serious crisis within the Western Alliance since 1945 as the US sides with Russia. Europe is desperate for ways to fire up defence expenditure, which is paltry compared with America's contribution. So I just want to focus on the fact that it's now being stated as fact by newspapers and by analysts that I've seen and other reporters on TV that the US has sided with Russia. Now they sided with Russia, this is happening. It's almost like, right, we understand that that's a thing. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. The EU has not traditionally involved itself in funding armed forces, preferring since the 1950s to build roads, subsidise farmers and establish cross-border cultural projects. But the pivot to financing military power underscores the radical and rapid reshaping of global dynamics. A bit of a pause here. I've talked about this a number of times, how it is very difficult to have a political and economic union if you do not take into account military within that, because wars are politics by other means type thing. A European geopolitical strategy and intra-political and interpolitical strategy amongst the fellow EU nations and European nations needs to take into account what happens when wars start between those nations or affecting those nations, such as on the edge of Europe. But the Balkans is that would have been the edge of the EU at that point. So you need to be thinking about defence, but also this then concerns information warfare and cyber warfare, okay, and propaganda. So there's that element as well. And also industry. So if you want to stimulate your industries to make sure that everything's going along tickety-boo economically, then you need to be thinking, well, actually, what's our defence strategy? Because do we need to invest in the military-industrial complex in order to ramp up production for our geopolitical and defence strategies? Well, if you don't have defence in your strategizing, then you're not going to be able to do all of these things. So it's been a long time coming, but the EU has recognised that defence has to be part of its overall strategy in a way that it would be for the UK, right? For any country outside of the EU. We are marrying up our economic strategies with our industrial strategies and our defence strategies and thinking about national security and where do we procure these things from to make sure that we remain secure if our ally that we're getting these components from becomes a turncoat. So the EU is having to think about all of these strategies together. Okay. In a speech on Tuesday, 48 hours before the EU's 27 national leaders are to hold a crisis summit in Brussels, so that's on March 6th, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said governments should be able to draw on 150 billion euros in loans over the next 5 years. This is not money that already exists in any budget. It would involve the Commission using its financial heft to borrow cash that it would then loan to an individual governments, and they would eventually need to pay back. The loans could be used to buy artillery, missiles, ammunition, drones, and anti-drone systems, and will also enable EU countries to send weapons to Kyiv. It would allow governments to massively step up their support to Ukraine, von der Leyen added. But 150 billion euros between 27 countries over 5 years will barely touch the sides. By way of comparison, the US, which is the biggest military spender in the world, has earmarked $883 billion for defence just this year. Von der Leyen's plan, which still needs signing off by governments, is similar to how the bloc raised money to help countries recover from the COVID pandemic, with the difference being that there will be no free money. This plan consists entirely of loans. Several EU officials signalled that the 93 billion euros of unclaimed loans that were earmarked for that COVID fund could now be channeled into defence, so that'd be useful. The stark questions over Europe's security following Trump's election to the White House was thrown into an even sharper focus on Monday night when the US president announced the suspension of all military aid to Ukraine. Another effort to show force following last week's bullying of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office. In the wake of Trump's announcement, European politicians reiterated their support for Kyiv. Kremlin spokesperson Peskov, meanwhile, celebrated the news, describing it as the best contribution towards peace, according to state-controlled media RIA Novosti. So, von der Leyen said the announcement was part of a Rearm Europe plan to unlock up to 800 billion euros so that's going to be almost $1 trillion, really. 800 billion of additional defence spending over the coming years. She outlined these ideas in a letter to national governments on Tuesday morning. What follows now is an intense period of diplomacy within the EU, between the EU and the UK, within the wider Western alliance. That includes Turkey, Canada and Norway, and with the US. The bloc's 27 national ambassadors are meeting on Tuesday to sketch out a plan for the emergency summit between leaders in Brussels on Thursday. Leaders are expected to endorse this 150 billion plan as part of a wider conversation that in the immediate term will also be about sending more of its own money to Ukraine, and in the longer term is about nothing less than the future of the continent itself. Quote, Europe is ready to massively boost its defence spending, both to respond to the short-term urgency to act and support Ukraine, but also to address the long-term need to take on more responsibility for our own European security, von der Leyen said. Countries in NATO aim for defence spending of 2% of gross domestic product, but in recent days France and the UK have signalled their intention to go far beyond that. On Sunday, French President Emmanuel Macron said that his goal was to raise French expenditure to between 3 and 3.5% of GDP, which would involve spending around 27 billion euros more than its current 2.1% level. Part of the EU's problem is that governments find it tricky to spend more on defence without falling foul of the bloc's beefed up debt and deficit rules aimed at preventing an economic crisis. But it's clear that averting a military crisis now takes precedent. To allow more spending, von der Leyen said she will trigger the EU's national escape clause, under which military expenditure would not be counted towards the bloc's punishment mechanism for countries breaching the EU spending limits. This clause can be activated when exceptional circumstances outside the control of the member state leads to a major impact on the public finances of a country, according to the spending rules that were revamped only last year. Von der Leyen, however, did not lay out the specific conditions she will attach to prevent rampant spending from highly indebted countries. EU finance ministers will discuss this in a planned meeting on Monday and Tuesday next week, according to an internal note seen by Politico. The Commission President also floated repurposing more regional funds for defence purposes, unlocking private capital by creating an EU-wide investment space and changing the rules of the European Investment Bank to allow more military spending. So that's all in place. Again, how quickly will that materialise in terms of how quickly will that manifest as to there being more equipment funded by the EU on the front lines in Ukraine? And that's the big question, right? Now, we are going to be talking a little bit later about how Europe moves away from dependence on the US in terms of defense tech. UTELSAT, says French aid to Ukraine, quoting the Financial Times, said it was in talks with the European governments about providing additional satellite connectivity in Ukraine, as investors bet that the French satellite operator could replace Elon Musk's Starlink in the country. UTELSAT said its talks with European governments were focused on using a combination of the satellite constellations, OneWeb, at about 1,200 kilometers above the Earth, and geosatellites about 35,000 kilometers to strengthen satellite connectivity in Ukraine and the Black Sea region. Both are capable of providing connectivity for Ukrainian drones, which have inflicted serious damage on Russian forces. Some military experts believe any large concentration of Russian troops or tanks would be decimated by Ukrainian drone attacks. Okay, there is that, and also ICI is a Finnish setup that is also providing satellite provision, as I'm sure there are many others, and they seem to be doing a pretty good job as well, as I reported in my hits and losses video this morning. Now, France, Germany, and the UK are moving towards a plan to seize 200 billion euros of frozen Russian assets to backstop a potential ceasefire deal in Ukraine, as per the Financial Times. French officials are proposing a plan that would immediately seize the assets if Russia were to violate a ceasefire. So it's not about seizing it now and then getting that money straight to Ukraine. But if there's a ceasefire, then that money is like another deterrent. That money, that Russian money, will immediately be used to support Ukraine. So that's I think a pretty good thing, as long as you can get the money fairly quickly. Fabian Hoffman has said nothing unexpected this morning. Back in November, I outlined where the key bottlenecks would emerge if the US withdraws its aid. Actually, no, we'll come to that later, because actually that is, that's for later. Right, so before that, the training of future employees of the Ukrainian Baykar plant. So Bayraktar drones that were made in Turkey, there are going to be drones now made by Baykar in Ukraine. They are already being trained in Turkey. 20 students of the Kiev Aviation Institute and 14 future employees who are mastering the necessary skills to launch the production of these drones are being trained. So that's really good news. Australia is open to sending its peacekeeping force to Ukraine to help. At the moment it's French and British who have said that they are open to that. Prime Minister Albanese says Australia is open to consideration of contributing troops to Ukrainian peacekeeping efforts, marking a shift from previous governments, the previous government's position. So that's really good news. A senior Pentagon official speaking on the condition, are we there yet? Yes. So we are seeing that the US have announced they are stopping aid to Ukraine going from the US forthwith, straight away, and that includes aid that's already found its way to Poland, and that's aid that's already been bought and paid for, and has been appropriated through Congress. PDA aid. I presume it's not affecting USAI, or is it? I wonder. The orders from business, because then, interesting. If you're ordering, say, a bunch of, I don't know, let's make it up, Patriot PAC-3 interceptors through the USAI funding. Remember, there's PDA, Presidential Drawdown Authority, when you're taking from your own stockpiles and giving them to Ukraine, and you use other funding to fill in the gaps there. USAI funding was putting orders into your businesses to then build that, manufacture that stuff, and then you get that to Ukraine. Is it that's also being stopped as well? The official said all military equipment not currently in Ukraine would be paused. So I presume it does, including weapons in transit and on aircraft and ships, or waiting in transit areas in Poland. Absolutely incredible decision that has been made, and it's caused a lot of consternation today. There's been 0 PDA shipments in almost 40 days of second Trump administration, well before the contentious Oval Office meeting. I'd heard otherwise. I'd heard that there's an awful lot of stuff in Poland, and that stuff is still getting through. So there could well be a lot in Poland that is being delivered to Ukraine. It's being kept there because it's safe to keep it there. You don't, if you've got like 200 Bradleys, right? You don't want to put them all in Ukraine and then have a store place get hit by a bunch of missiles. So you keep them in Poland. But the problem now is the US is saying, well, that's not getting to Ukraine. There's your issue. There have been 0 PDA shipments in almost 40 days of the second Trump administration, well before the contentious Oval Office meeting, though there's still money left in the PDA. It's $3.8 billion. Thus, it was never about Oval Office meeting, which is just a pretext. Trump and co. peace plan is to coerce. So that flow of arms has been halted. Now, the aid pause order affects more than $1 billion in arms and ammunition in the pipeline and on order So that is USAI orders then, according to Shashank Joshi, or the New York Times here. It resulted from a series of meetings at the White House on Monday between Mr. Trump and his senior national security aides. And Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, and all those were in on that. Now, Ukrainian authorities believe that the suspension of military aid from the US will lead to the loss of territory. According to Politico, Ukraine will have to choose whether to protect an airfield or power plant or a weapons factory due to the shortage of interceptor missiles for 5 Patriot systems, according to the Financial Times. Super concern there. Now, this is the first poll, says Aaron Blake, I've seen in a long time to show the percentage who say we're providing not enough support to Ukraine outpacing too much. And this is, I think, a general number. Republicans are shifting their opinion, but as I've said previously, their opinion is being driven by Trump and his team rather than the Trump and his team being reflective of that position. Independents, so this is the key. Independents one went from +9 with too much in January to +13 for not enough last week. This was conducted before the Oval Office blow up. So that's interesting. We have January 2023 at the bottom, up through February to February 2024 to March 2025. There's too much support for Ukraine has gone up from 26% in January 2023 last year to 34% now. But the good news is that hasn't changed from 2024 in February. Now, not enough, this is what he's saying is the key, has now gone up. There are more people saying, actually, we're not providing enough aid to Ukraine. About the right amount, that has sort of shifted here and there and unsure. So actually, there are more people being sure that not enough is being provided, and not a massive shift in too much support. So that's good news, what we have seen. So that my guess is that's probably mainly Democrats moving from don't know and about the right amount to no, they need more, so getting worried. People like myself, if I was in the US, I'd be like a Democrat voter out the two, and so that would be maybe my opinion. Yeah, it's about right to no, actually need loads more. This is getting serious now. Whereas the direction of travel for the Republican electorate seems to be going the other way. A few words on the US military aid to Ukraine. This came in 2 flavors: Presidential Drawdown Authority that took things from existing US stockpiles, and the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative procured new things from US companies, says Shashank Joshi from The Economist. So here we have a CSIS graph that shows you in the millions of US dollars how much it was given in terms of USAI and PDA, and actually a lot of orders of USAI going on there. Now, the bulk, he says, of the PDA that was notified by Biden was delivered by January the 20th, and with the exception of some armoured vehicles which needed repair, there was about 3.8 billion of that left. A big part of that was delivery of NATO standard ammo. If that stops, Ukraine faces an eventual crunch. The question is when. USAI was used for some key weapons, air defence systems, interceptors, high-end electronic warfare, armaments for jets. Orders in the pipeline would or will deliver this year and next. Cancelling it rather than just pausing, as has happened, would require cancelling contracts. My understanding is that even without PDA deliveries, Ukraine would be fine for some months as long as it remained on the defensive. The serious problems arise down the line, not in days or weeks. All of this assumes that US intelligence support and Starlink provision would continue. Michael Hoffman says the suspension of US assistance for Ukraine is very unfortunate and significant development, but it may not have an immediate impact, rather like Joshi. Ukraine is far less dependent on the US for day-to-day battlefield needs in 2025 than it was in earlier periods of the war. Ukraine's current approach to defensive operations combines mines, strike drones, and traditional artillery fires to attrit Russian forces at 0 to 30 kilometers. Most of the casualties are now inflicted with mines and drones which are produced in Ukraine. Traditional artillery fires are less relevant at the moment, and there is a relative parity between the two sides. In combination with the munitions recently delivered by the US in recent months, which front-loaded supplies, Europeans could sustain Ukraine through this year. However, Ukraine is likely to begin metering fire rates at this point, given the uncertainty and therefore Russia will re-establish some degree of fire advantage, but this is no longer decisive given more than 50% of casualties are inflicted by drones of various types. Really, really solid point there. The issue becomes more problematic when looking at long-range precision strikes beyond 30 kilometers. Here, systems like GMLRS, guided multiple launch rocket system, HIMARS and whatnot, are still quite relevant. The interceptors for the US provided advanced air defense and missile defense. The impact will be pronounced over time. Another important area is maintenance. Parts and technical support suspension will result in degradation of operational readiness over time. It's also unclear if the cutoff involves intelligence support, training and other forms of indirect support. Much depends on the extent Ukraine has been stockpiling munitions and parts and where Europeans can step in. Although in some cases they have low inventories, and in others US retains the ability to deny any transfers. The impact will probably be much more visible in a few months. Finally, if it is just a halt to further shipments of munitions and equipment, then the effect will be in specific categories of capability. But if all forms of US support are suspended, then it's more difficult to assess the systemic impact and follow-on ripple effects. Okay, thanks to you. And then finally, from this kind of angle, Fabian Hoffman, who's a kind of missiles expert, says nothing unexpected this morning. Back in November, I outlined where the key bottlenecks would emerge if the US withdraws its aid. These are rocket artillery, Patriot interceptors, long-range strike weapons. The biggest issue, in my view, is a sustainable delivery of PAC-2 GEM-T and PAC-3 MSE interceptors, which are critical for intercepting Russian N9 M723 short range and KH-47N2 Kinzhal. Those are the daggers. Medium-range ballistic missiles. So there's a kind of quasi-hypersonic missile and a ballistic missiles, but also cruise missiles as well. We have to find a way of keeping those interceptors coming even without direct US support. That may mean buying them from the US or depleting our own stocks, but we can't let Ukraine go without them. On long-range strike weapons, Ukraine has successfully set up its own production lines, drastically reducing its dependency on the US. Still, European states are now the only ones able to provide the heavy hitters, i.e. large caliber missiles. That's what's going to be a challenge. Now, Shashank Joshi says, comedy is all in the timing. That reminds me of a joke. Do you know what the secret of comedy is? Timing! Funny. The Federation of American Scientists published a report Wednesday compiling evidence it says strongly suggests the US Air Force is planning to bring nuclear weapons back to Royal Air Force Base Lakenheath in England. Well, isn't that funny? Because that's at a time when we're thinking about, bases leaving from Europe, the US wanting to take their troops out of Europe and then not wanting to procure American equipment. This would be, of course, says Joshi, this would of course make it more attractive for UK to buy F-35A and get into nuclear sharing missions. Personally, I think it would be insane for the UK to go down the path of increasing dependency right now, even if it has to manage existing dependencies. Now, on that note, we are going to first of all look at some economic challenges already. Colby Badwar says it can still get much, much worse. Lots of panic chatter about the increased likelihood of a year-long continued resolution could be heard today at the AFA Warfare Symposium. Combined with the pause on aid to Ukraine, it's an unmitigated disaster for the defence industrial base. So this is a headline that says US manufacturing activity nears stagnation while prices jump. So there's going to be a lot of things going on economically speaking. The tariffs are going to be hitting hard. In fact, Target CEO said, it's a big shop in the US, said they're going to be putting their prices up this week. I think or very soon. So price is going to go up just generally. That is going to affect the competitiveness of weapons. And so inflation is going to hit defense manufacturing, partly because of all these tariffs and because the Trump administration is not doing a good job of tackling inflation, which he said he'd do on day one. So that means that these items will be less price competitive across the world. But aside from that, you're going to have tariff wars, meaning people are not, and the US also saying that they've basically joined Russia and them not being a constant or reliable ally. And so for any nations, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, for any nation's defense procurement, from their own national security point of view, they are going to want to buy either indigenously or from, if you're within a bloc like the EU, you're going to want to buy from the EU. So all of this is looking bad for the US economically. And there are going to be a lot of defense manufacturers in the US who are not happy right now. Their stock prices, their share prices have tanked compared to, or gone down considerably compared to the the EU and European defense manufacturers whose share price has gone through the roof. Now, Pekka Kalianiemi says the US seems to be heading for a recession due to the upcoming tariffs and anti-EU policies. Europeans should stick to buying European. List below your favourite European products, blah, blah, blah. So you're starting to see this kind of circling around a wagon. But this is coming from the Fed, I think, saying that evolution, the Atlanta Fed GDP now, real GDP estimate for Q1 2025. Wow. So the GDP estimate is going into the negatives there. That is a real challenge. And indeed, since January, it has been on the way down and then dropping off a cliff. So this could be really serious for the Americans, and that might affect public sentiment. It might affect polls, and it might affect the American government in a way that they would seek to change this. So one of my hopes for continued provision of aid to Ukraine is that if you stopped aid, including USAI, including the orders to your companies, if you stop that flowing, then these companies are not making money. Your GDP goes down and your tax income goes down and people lose their jobs, right? So actually there's an economic argument for continued aid to Ukraine, and that will have more purchase than any ideological argument for Trump and his lackeys. Michael McKay or others have reported that a gunpowder plant in Perm in Russia was on fire yesterday, 1,500 kilometers from the line. So I don't know what happened there. I did report that this morning, but that may affect Russian ability to produce munitions. And then we hear the ISW saying the Russian military recruitment has surpassed targets due to financial incentives and prison recruitment. Western aid could deepen Russia's economic and military strain, pushing Putin towards meaningful negotiations in 2025, the ISW said. So they are surpassing recruitment. Did they not get something like 30 to 40,000 extra people last year? But it's like way off where they need to be. And it's not looking good for Russia. So some challenges there. Now, goodness me, it's been quite a long one. But actually, I want to talk about some Thomas Tyner threads here that are relevant to how easy or difficult it's going to be for European nations to distance themselves from the US in terms of technological and manufacturing dependencies. These are a couple of long threads. I'll try and rush through them. Thomas Tyner says, and take his opinions with a pinch of salt, of course. He's not the oracle or anything. Let's talk about American weapons and how Europe has to wean itself off them. Part one of a long thread. This one is looking at fighter jets as an example. First and foremost, Europe has to get all American-made components out of all weapon systems produced in Europe. If Trump can shut down a European production line by withholding a component, then the component has to be replaced. And if that is impossible, then the weapon system has no future and the production has to end. As for the F-35, Europe has nothing even close to combat capability. The best course will be to see the existing deals through and then focus on acquiring Eurofighters and Rafales, both of which are way more capable than whatever junk Russia sends up in the air, but of course not as capable of the F-35. The main issue will be the Rafale's production line is running already at full capacity, while the Eurofighter assembly lines in the UK, Italy, Germany and Spain should, in theory, be able to triple output to 60 fighters per year. But there are many uncertainties as the stinginess of European governments led to the Spanish and German lines being suspended in 2018. But of course, now with that funding coming through from the EU, you might see a change there. So at least the assembly line in Germany was restarted in 2023 at a very low rate. As for the Gripen, it is dead. Sweden being stingy in 2012 and opting for the US-made GF414 G39E engines instead of further developing the Swedish-made RM12EF engine means that the Gripen E either has to switch engine, which is costly, or production will end once the last Gripen E comes off the production line in Linköping, or when Trump suspends engine deliveries. For the future, Europe needs to focus on getting the British, Japanese, Italian Global Combat Air Program. So that's the Tempest, which is the 6th generation fighter that would be, a step up from the F-35. GCAP into service ASAP. The competing French, German, Spanish Future Combat Air Systems FCAS will come years later, if at all. And as for fighter weapons, almost every European Air Force has its depots full of US-made AIM-120 AMRAAM and AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles. And i.e. Sweden and Germany are currently buying 1,219 AIM-120C8 missiles for $3.5 billion, even though Europe produces the Meteor missile, which is better than the AIM-120C8. As said before, see the current deals through, but then buy European missiles only. This means the European Air Forces have to buy Meteor or the cheaper, less ranged French Mica. That's what they have on the, or Mika, on the Mirage 2000s that they've received from France in Ukraine. The Mika NGRF, when they need a radar-guided beyond visual range air-to-air missile, and buy the German RST, British ASRAAM, or French Mika NGIR when they need an infrared homing missile. So there are options, but they're not as good. As for anti-ship missiles, Exocet AIM-39B 2.2 for the Rafale, RBS-15 Mark IV Air for the Gripen. There are also other options, but they use American engines. So there's an Italian one and a Norwegian one there as well. In both cases, it should be possible to replace the American engines with French microturbo Tri-40, which is used in the aforementioned Exocet, and the Norwegian surface-launched naval strike missile, which was the basis for the development of the air-launched joint strike missile. Okay, so the RBS-15 uses a French microturbo Tri-60 engine, which is also used in the British, French, and Scalp Storm Shadow cruise missiles. German Taurus, though, uses a Williams P8315 engine, which means it needs to be redesigned. So the Taurus depends on American tech, whereas the Scalp and Storm Shadow don't. As for an air-to-air, air-to-surface missiles and bombs, it's not looking good. The British Brimstone initially used an American-made orbital ATK rocket engine. As far as I know, the newer Brimstone 2 uses a French-made engine. However, the newest British air-to-surface missile, the Spear 3, uses an American Pratt & Whitney TJ-150 engine. When it comes to guidance kits for bombs, almost everyone in Europe uses the American-made Paveway or JDAM kits. Only Europeans-made option are the French AASM hammer kits, which are being used very widely in Ukraine, but even the AASM uses the American-controlled GPS. Europe licensed produces Paveway and JDAM kits, but long-term Europe has to only produce European guidance kits, which then also use Galileo PRS instead of GPS. As for targeting pods, most European air forces brought the Israeli Lightning, but again, the French developed their own system. First, the Damocles, and now the Talios. Talios is cutting edge and so far only compatible with the Rafale, but European air forces should consider adding it to the Eurofighter. Where Europe has nothing to compete with the US are SEAD, so that's the suppression of enemy air defense systems. Before you start a war, really, you want to take out all the enemy air defense systems, so you blow them up with air-to-surface missiles or harm missiles, so anti-radiation missiles. A key weapon system for this mission are anti-radiation missiles. The UK developed and produced such a missile, namely the Alarm, but in 2013 it was taken out of service. Ukraine received older American AGM-88 HARM missiles, which were essential to push back Russian ground-based air defense systems. Europe not only does no longer produce its own anti-radiation missiles, most modern fighters can't even use them. 15 German Eurofighters will get the ability to use AGM-88E advanced anti-radiation guided missile by 2030. As Russia deploys a massive number of ground-based air defense systems like the S-400, S-300, Buk, Pantsir, etc., Europe needs to produce its own anti-radiation missile and mount it on more fighters, as currently 85% of NATO's SEAD mission aircraft are provided by the US Air Force. Italy and Germany maintain 13 respectively and 21. Outdated Tornado ECR fighters for the SEAD missions. while the US Air Force has 200 plus F-16 DM Block 50 fighters. So the US, if you're going to be doing kind of NATO missions or whatever, the US are going to be doing most of the SEAD activities. Yes, European Air Forces also plan to use the AGM-88G AARGM-ER with their F-35A, but that is an American missile on an American fighter, and have a locally produced missile is better for Europe's defence capabilities, for Europe's industry, and for Europe's future. I did not dive into the avionics systems, as Europe can produce all of them. It's just a question of will to remove US systems. Overall, Europe can defend itself against Russia, but that will require no more US components to secure production lines in wartime from American sabotage, and investing a lot more into developing, producing, and buying European systems. Europe can do it if European politicians stop deluding themselves, and the US will be a trustworthy partner again once Trump is gone. A, he will die in office no matter what the term limits are, and B, after him, the regime will vote into power someone worse, Vance or Trump Jr. So, be more French Europe and start developing and buying European only. Next up, aircraft. So what I'll do is I'll probably leave this for tomorrow and do one on aircraft, tanker, marine patrols, and airborne early warning aircraft, and see whether Europe is able to distance themselves from the US and get independence in terms of that tech. Hopefully that was of use. There was a lot of letters involved in that and geekery, but I think it's good to get a sense of what is going on. Thank you very much for watching, and please do remember that there is a it's not that one. Why does it keep coming up? That one. There is a let's go to that one anyway and do it this way. Active campaigns on with NAFO, Help 99. As you can see, ATP Geopolitics, Rick the Ukrainian, and Roman Trochimets. We are, wow, at 14,224. That's absolutely brilliant. 18%. So we're moving along there as we have just hit the target for now 7 thermal optic drones through Jiggers Port. So that's amazing. You guys are amazing. You blow my mind. We're going to do a live tomorrow with Jonathan Fink and do the raffle for to see who has won the goodies from Jiggers Port. But if you do have the wherewithal, please help out with this campaign as well. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.